The Americans with Disabilities Act can be difficult to comply with for employers, businesses, and people with disabilities. I'm Dan Ringer, and we'll talk about the ADA right now on the LawWorks.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
Closed captioning for the LawWorks is made possible by a grant from the Monongalia County Bar Association to support legal information and education for all West Virginians. The LawWorks is made possible by major grants from the Office of the West Virginia Attorney General and from Software Systems Incorporated, a West Virginia company established in 1975 which provides high-end support services, programming, and consulting for county government AS400 mid-range computer systems, as well as PC-based systems, and by a grant from the West Virginia Bar Foundation. The West Virginia Bar Foundation, the philanthropic organization for West Virginia's legal profession and justice system, promoting public knowledge of the law in West Virginia.
Is the Americans with Disabilities Act worth all the expense and trouble? My guests are occupational therapist Carol Kisner McGraw and Dr. Beth Loy of the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy Job Accommodation Network. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you. Thank you.
Couldn't you just be with the Job Accommodation Network? There's a huge amount to say.
It is the government.
Yes. What is the Job Accommodation Network?
Well, we know it as JAN, and we are a free technical assistance service that provides information on the employment provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
So you deal with the workplace and you consult with whom?
With employers, with individuals, friends, family members, rehab professionals.
And from time to time lawyers, because I have called your office.
Absolutely.
A huge help with some difficult problems sometimes. These are people to remember, and we'll have contact information for you later in the show. We're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. Beth, what is it?
Well, it's a federal law that prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities and requires, under Title I, the employment provisions requires that employers make accommodations for individuals so that individuals can continue to do their jobs.
That sends cold chills.
Does it?
Through the bosses. When you say you have to make accommodations for people, how does it come about? Suppose I have some kind of disability or limitation and I want to apply with Carol's company for a job. Now, it may not be obvious that I have a problem.
Right.
What happens? I come in, apply for the job, and she looks at me and says, "You look okay, but you have any disabilities?"
No, that would be something that would send cold chills down an attorney's back as well. So you certainly cannot do that. The key is whether the individual can perform the job, and if the individual has a disability and doesn't need any accommodations and doesn't want to disclose, then the person's hired and the person goes to work. It's just a pretty simple process. If the individual needs an accommodation, then it's up to the individual to make that request, and then the employer looks at the job and sees what type of accommodations would work. In other words, it's a relationship. The individual and the employer work together to find solutions.
So it's up to the employee to say, "I need some accommodation to do this job"?
Right, right.
And then the employer calls you.
Well, a lot of times, yes, the employer will contact the Job Accommodation Network, or they'll go online to our website and research different ways to communicate with the individual and come up with different ideas that might be effective. When you were talking about things being expensive, they're just not. 58% of all accommodations cost nothing. They're just a part of doing business. They might be a different kind of pen or a different color of notepad. It might be something real simple like a different color file folder. So most accommodations don't really cost anything.
And it can really be simple. A few years ago I was having in my hands some symptoms of carpal tunnel syndrome, And I resolved that myself, didn't have to call anybody. I just took the keyboard off the table where it usually sat and put it in my lap. And within a couple of weeks, those symptoms had resolved. It was just a matter of having a long enough cord on the keyboard to get it into my lap. And now we have wireless keyboards, and people just don't even think about that anymore.
Correct.
Or a wireless mouse, so it can be closer to you, so you don't have to reach out a long way. Carol, you're in a wheelchair.
Yes.
You've had some firsthand experience with the Americans with Disabilities Act. When did you first become aware of it, and what did it mean to you?
At the time, I didn't realize just what it did mean for me. It passed the same year that I had my spinal cord injury. So I just remember my physical therapist saying, this act just passed and it's going to change the way you live. You're going to be able to go places, you're going to be able to do things, you're going to be able to be out. And I remember thinking, oh, whatever. But, you know, as it's been enacted and the changes have come slowly, but as the changes come, there's less and less places that I can't go and less things that I can't do.
When I try to explain the ADA to people, I do it in kind of a half humorous way. I explain to them that a few years ago, nobody was in a wheelchair. You walk down the street, you didn't see anybody in wheelchairs. You go to the mall, you didn't see anybody in wheelchairs. Then they passed this ADA and everybody went out and got a wheelchair because look at all these people, where were they? And they were at home.
Yes, they were at home.
They couldn't get out at all. You're an occupational therapist, and specifically you're a certified hand therapist, so you deal with hands, arms, upper extremities.
Shoulders, yes.
Shoulders. The ADA is a two-way street because the first test, Beth, is the person who wants the job has to be able to perform the job.
Correct.
With some accommodation, and the word reasonable accommodation, the word reasonable's in there. I hate the word reasonable because we never know what it means specifically. But how do you prepare people who have suffered some sort of catastrophic injury to get back into the workplace? What do you expect of them?
Well, I think it's important for them to be realistic about what their injury is and is it possible? Because, you know, there are times that it's just not going to be a reasonable goal to get back to that. And if you set someone up for failure in that way, you know, it's just catastrophic to them. Once you determine, yes, they could return, then we start looking at, once we get past the acute stage of wounds and healing and precautions, we start work conditioning, getting them ready so that they can return to their employment, whether that be with accommodations, adaptive equipment.
I suppose the goal is so that you don't have to have accommodation. You'd like to be back to 100%.
Yes.
But practically speaking, if somebody's working with you, it's 100% recovery is probably not something they should expect.
That's not always true. That's not always the case. Depends on the degree of the injury.
You can fix them.
Sometimes.
But with help sometimes too.
With help sometimes, and that's not a bad thing. And sometimes it's hard to get people to realize that adaptive equipment is their friend. It is okay to use it. It doesn't set you apart. It just makes you more efficient in doing your position.
When we talk about adaptive equipment, what are we talking about?
Like she said, it may be something as simple as a build-up ink pen, a different desk. I know, like for me, when I went back to work, the biggest thing for me was I didn't fit under the desks that they had. So it may be just something as simple as adjusting a desk height, or, you know, if you're not going to be proficient at typing, then Dragon, you know. Dragon
software. The reason Carol's on this show is I personally had an encounter with her a few months ago when I suffered a significant injury to both of my wrists and I had to go have some therapy. And one of the things I discovered early on was a computer program. It used to be called Dragon Naturally Speaking. It's now just called Dragon Software. And it is amazing. I can dictate into my computer. It translates it into text better than I could and quicker than I could if I was typing myself. It is absolutely amazing. And there are other software products out there. I'm not suggesting that's the one you should buy, but it is relatively inexpensive. And by that we mean around $100. And sometimes even less. But those kinds of things are available and work really well. So, Beth, we talk about reasonable accommodation. Would my boss spending $100 for a piece of software be a reasonable accommodation?
More than likely, yes. Reasonable means it's something that the employer can do. It's a reasonable cost. It doesn't cause the employer an undue hardship. It's essentially as simple and as complicated as that.
We're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. My guests are occupational therapist Carol Kisner McGraw and Dr. Beth Loy with the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy and the Job Accommodation Network, which is housed at West Virginia University. When we talk about being able to do the job, we talk in terms of the essential functions of the job.
Right.
Can you describe for us a little bit about what that means?
Well, say in your job, for example, would you consider getting prepared for the show to be an essential function of your job, to do your research and to prep for the show?
First of all, it's not a job. I do this as a volunteer. But yes.
Say, for example,
it is
was
a job. I just don't get paid very well for it. But yeah, being able to do research, being able to type, being able to take notes are essential functions of this.
Right. So say something like if you need to send a fax, but you can't access the fax machine, and you need to send your research to someone else to say double check. Would faxing be an essential function of your job?
Yeah, it could easily be.
It might be, but in most situations it probably isn't. Probably the essential part of your job would be getting the information together. And faxing the information would be a marginal part of your job.
So you look at the issue and then they would say in computer language, parse it. You break it down into its essential terms.
Right.
And what is the real purpose here? I think the job that needs to be done is to fax something to someone, but what the job really is conveying information to someone.
Exactly. And that's your essential function. The actual faxing of the information would probably be a marginal function. And all those situations are different. Different jobs have different types of essential functions. And you look at the history of the job and the repercussions of what happens if that person doesn't do that part of the job.
This sounds like in the early 20th century, there were efficiency experts who would go around and dissect job functions or jobs and say, this is where the bottleneck is, this is where the problem is. That's kind of what you need to do with jobs now, not to necessarily increase efficiency, but to make the performance of the task possible.
Well, we always want to know what is the job actually there for the person to do. And most employers, I would think, would also want to know that. So you need to make sure that you have your job descriptions and those job descriptions are up to date. Because oftentimes, typing is not an essential function of a position. Getting the information into the computer in a certain database or in a certain format would be the essential function of the job. And the speech recognition software that you both were talking about would be something that could enable somebody who doesn't have the ability to type to get that information where it needs to be.
One of the things I have noticed about some adaptive technologies, like voice recognition software, is that while I was injured, and I really couldn't use my hands at all for a period of 3 or 4 months, I got used to using this software, and it was so efficient that when I did regain the ability to manipulate a keyboard and move things around, I've continued to use it because it's good for everybody.
Right.
Some of these technologies just are wonderful. Before the program started, we were talking about things that can be called reachers, that are extensions that have a couple of suction cups on the end. You can pick things up with them. Well, if you have a bad back or are limited in some way in being able to bend over and pick up things off the floors, they're wonderful. I've used them for years because they're just really convenient sometimes too. So some of these technologies are good for everybody.
Exactly. Especially with, think of your tablet that you carry with you now or your smartphone that you take with you. A lot of those technologies that we take for granted now were designed to accommodate someone who had a disability. You can change your fonts, you can talk to your phone can talk back to you. Just even the vibrate setting for someone who doesn't have hearing or has low hearing, the vibration on the phone will indicate to them, hey, you have a text message or you have a message waiting or something else you need to do.
And some of these smartphones, the screens are relatively small. If you have any kind of vision impairment, it's nice to be able to increase the size of the text to read them. But if you don't have a vision impairment, it's still nice to be able to increase the size of the text to read it to make sure you don't make mistakes with these things. There have been some changes with the ADA. It's not your father's ADA, if you want to say, your mother. It has been refined, it has been expanded. What are the more recent changes?
Well, the recent changes came with a law called the Americans with Disabilities Act Amendments Act of 2008, and it went into effect in the beginning of 2009. And essentially what it did was expand that definition of disability under the ADA so that more people with different types of impairments would be covered. Because believe it or not, Congress actually agreed on something, and that was that the original intent of the ADA was not meeting the goals that Congress wanted it to meet. So they made those modifications, and now it should be more clear-cut as to if a person has an impairment, and that substantially limits major life activity, that person's probably going to be entitled to reasonable accommodations from an employer. Because we used to get caught up in, is this impairment a disability versus this one? Is this person severely injured enough in order to be covered? And quite frankly, the courts were not covering a lot of people who had these types of impairments. And so now that looks to be changing with the implementation of this law.
We're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. My guests are occupational therapist Carol Kisner McGraw and Dr. Beth Loy of the, and I want to get this right, so I have to find it, Job Accommodation Network, the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, Job Accommodation Network, and that's housed at West Virginia University. We said we would tell people how to get in touch with you. How can they get in touch with you?
Well, you can actually call us and we answer our phone. The phone number is 800-526-7234. And you can find us online at askjan.org.
800-526-7234 or askjan.org.
Correct.
On the internet, of course. You talked about being limited in major life activities. What are major life activities?
Typically, there are things like walking, talking, speaking, breathing, performing manual tasks. It might be being able to concentrate or thinking or remembering. Really, that list has been expanded as well. It used to be pretty restricted, but now it's just the things that we do in everyday life.
Things like thinking, remembering. We talked about bosses getting cold chills when they're when they encounter things like this. What should an employer anticipate with an employee who's having memory problems? And sometimes this is a long-term employee whose memory is just starting to develop issues. How do you accommodate things like that?
Well, in a situation like that, it might be something simple. For example, color coding email. It might be a feature that you use on your email so that you can prioritize the tasks that you need to do for that week versus the ones that, aren't priority for that week. It could be something like having additional meetings with the person. Instead of having one longer meeting with that individual, having shorter meetings, say weekly, so that you can discuss the upcoming task for the next week. Could be something as simple as that.
And just keeping a calendar is very helpful.
Right.
Taking notes.
Taking notes, keep a notebook.
You see multi-layered issues, Carol, in your practice. Somebody comes in and suffers, let's call it a catastrophic event. It may be broken bones, the loss of a limb, something like that. But there are other things that come along with that.
Yes.
Post-traumatic stress disorder or syndrome, loss of memory. Do you treat all of these things at one time, or do you send them out? How does it work?
As an occupational therapist, my background is to address all of that. So my first eval is very lengthy, and I say, do you have memory deficits? I may do a quick visual screening with them and see, are there other things we need to address? And sometimes things will come out through the treatments that they're not even aware of that's a problem for them. And we just change things up as we go. You're
a bit exceptional, though. You're not just an occupational therapist. By original education, I believe you're a social worker.
My background was social work.
So you kind of work the problem, as they say.
Yes.
Does the employer have to be involved at the level Carol might be involved in the therapy to anticipate other problems, to look for other problems with an employee?
No, and employers shouldn't be looking for other problems with an individual. Basically, it's the employee's responsibility to say, hey, I need this accommodation in order to be more productive. Then the employer gets involved and they work together. The employer has a responsibility of engaging in a good faith effort to try to come up with those solutions. Where Carol might be helpful is providing that documentation to the employer about what the employer would need to do.
So can the employer get records from a healthcare provider?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Not directly, but can ask for the individual to get that documentation. And there are variations of that, but we certainly don't have time to talk about those today.
The Americans with Disabilities Act and the procedures to implement it can be hugely, hugely complex.
Right.
And that's actually what you're for, is to cut through some of that complexity.
Everything is case by case.
I envision a circumstance where the employer says, okay, it's time for the quarterly, semi-annually, annual evaluation. Carol, come into my office, we're going to talk about how you're doing, and you're having problems with this, 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 and this. That would seem like an opportunity for the employee to say,
It would.
I need something.
Absolutely. When you're doing those annual performance reviews, it's a good time if the employee is comfortable to go ahead and disclose and say, hey, you know, I'm having problems with this. I need an accommodation.
Is it up to the employee to say what the accommodation needs to be?
I would say it's helpful if the employee says, this is what I need. It's the employer's responsibility to come up with something that is effective. So, you know, when you're looking at resolving a situation, it's going to be both parties involved in what's going to work. We advise employees, and you probably do too, hey, this is what you need to take into your employer. And to go ahead and have that prepared, make it easy for the employer.
Once the issue of accommodation is raised, though, the employee says, I need help doing this. And it could be just that simple. I need help doing this. Does the duty then shift to the employer? Is it up to the employer to go out and try to find something?
It's up to the employer to research options given the way that the business runs and to come up with something that hopefully is a solution.
I want to give the contact information one more time for the Job Accommodation Network. The telephone number is 800-526-7234. 526-7234, or on the internet at askjan.org. And you have a lot of information there.
We do. We're very proud of the information that we managed to keep up to date for that site. And a lot of people like to just go on the site, and you can send questions in through email as well.
And that would be for both employers and employees.
And you certainly don't have to use your real name. Everything is confidential. Just, you know, give us enough information so that we can help guide you through the process.
Well, we've many times on this show, talking about employment law issues, advised that it is usually cheaper and more efficient to keep an employee that has been working for you, that has done a good job, than it is to replace them. And that's really a major purpose of the Americans with Disabilities Act, is to cause that to happen.
It is to retain good employees for a long period of time. 76% of all accommodation situations are successful. So this is not something that you're going to have a low probability of success that you're striving for.
Does this law apply to all employers?
Those employers who have 15 or more employees, and in some states it actually goes lower than that, depending on the state.
So there are state laws and federal laws. And if the state laws are more protective of the employee, then they would take precedence over the federal law.
And usually that is involved with employers who have fewer employees. Say, for example, employers with 6 or more in some states might be required to follow the ADA or the state law.
Is there any help out there financially for employers that need to make changes?
There are tax incentives available. I'm a proponent of thinking that there probably should be more than what is available.
There should always be more money for everything.
Right, exactly. So there are some.
Well, Dr. Beth Loy of the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, the Job Accommodation Network at West Virginia University. Thank you very much for being with us. Carol Kisner McGraw, Occupational Therapist, Certified Hand Therapist.
That's it.
Also. Your office is what?
3109, it's Hand and Upper Extremity Rehabilitation Center, and it's on University Avenue.
In Morgantown.
In Morgantown.
These are wonderful resources to have available here in West Virginia, and they, at least the Job Accommodation Network, is a national resource that gets a lot of national attention. On behalf of the LawWorks, I'm Dan Ringer. Good evening. If you would like to suggest a topic for a future The LawWorks show, or if you're a school teacher and would like to receive a DVD of this show for classroom use, send us an email to thelawworks@comcast.net or visit us on Facebook. On the LawWorks website at thelawworks.org, you'll find a listing of recent The LawWorks programs, additional information about this show's topic, and video of this and recent shows. You can also find the LawWorks programs on YouTube and iTunes.
The LawWorks is produced in cooperation with the Office of the West Virginia Attorney General, the West Virginia Bar Foundation, the Mountain State Bar, the Monongalia County Bar Association, and the West Virginia University College of Law. The LawWorks is made possible by major grants from the Office of the West Virginia Attorney General and from Software Systems Incorporated, a West Virginia company established in 1975 which provides high-end support services, programming, and consulting for county government AS400 mid-range computer systems, as well as PC-based systems, and by a grant from the West Virginia Bar Foundation. The West Virginia Bar Foundation, the philanthropic organization for West Virginia's legal profession and justice system, promoting public knowledge of the law in West Virginia. Additional support for the LawWorks is provided by the West Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.